Welcome to this advanced mini course in Next.js. We're going to cover middleware, data fetching, streaming, server actions, prefetching, revalidation, best practices for all of these, some things to look out for, and show you some examples along the way. So without further ado, let's get to our first video on middleware. What is it? What are some use cases of it? And then what are some not so good use cases of middleware? And then we'll also show a practical example of how middleware works and how you might use it for user roles. But we'll get to this in just a second. So first off, what is middleware? Well, middleware allows you to run code before a request completes. In other words, it runs in the middle of a request. And I kind of like to think about it as middleware is software that runs in the middle of a request, hence middleware. So a request occurs, and then before that request fully completes, you can run some code to either modify that request or do some other things, which kind of leads me into when would you actually use this software that runs in the middle of a request? Well, a very common example of it is using it for either authentication or authorization. And in particular, you might use it to protect routes in your application. So I have videos on showing you how to do this in Next.js, but basically, if a user is not logged in, you could check that in your code that runs in your middleware file. And if they're not logged in, then they can't access certain pages within your application. So if I tried to go to a certain page and the user isn't logged in, I could be like, hey, sorry, we're going to redirect you to the sign-in page. So before that request even completes and before we even try to show that other page that they're going to, we can redirect them to a different page. Also, for server-side redirects, I kind of just mentioned this, but maybe you have different users in your applications that have different roles. So maybe you have an admin role and maybe you have a partner role or different things like that. Well, depending on their role, you can redirect them to different pages. So say they try to go to the dashboard, but they should actually go to the admin dashboard. An example I actually will show you here in a sec. You could redirect them depending on what their user role is. And you could do that in middleware. That's a good time to use it. Also, if you're going to have any logging or analytics in your application, so capturing and analyzing your request data, that's where you can also use middleware. For feature flagging, so either enabling or disabling features depending on the request, you can also use middleware for that. And then also these days, there's quite a bit of bot traffic that can occur with different websites. You could also protect against that using middleware. So all of these are good use cases of middleware. Now, what are some not so good use cases? Well, anytime you're doing like complex data fetching, this should probably be done within server-side utilities or even within route handlers. Similarly, if you're going to do any sort of like heavy computation, then middleware probably isn't the correct place to do that because middleware should generally stay pretty lightweight and it should respond very quickly. Like middleware, it shouldn't be something that takes a long time to run. It should be pretty snappy and it shouldn't take a long time to run. So heavy computation or complex data fetching, not a good time to do that within your middleware file. Also, direct database stuff, it's probably better to do this within route handlers or server-side utilities once again. And even heavy computation, you could say between server-side utilities and route handlers. So basically, any stuff that's going to take longer to run or it's more kind of computationally expensive or data fetching or database management, all this probably shouldn't be done within middleware. And you should save middleware for some more kind of lightweight use cases like authentication, redirects, logging different stuff, feature flags, protecting routes from bot traffic, stuff like that. But now let's get into an example of using middleware within our Next.js application. So creating your middleware is as easy as creating a middleware.js or TS file within the root of your application. And this is very important. And I've had a lot of you comment on my videos that this has saved you a lot of time. You do not want your middleware.js file to be within your app directory. That is not going to work and your middleware is not going to run. And you might waste a lot of time wondering why your middleware isn't working. Because your middleware should be at the root of your application on the same level as your app directory, your different config files here, your next.config, your readme, these sort of files is the same level your middleware should be on. And then when creating your middleware.js file, there's a couple important things. So first off, you're going to export a function, and that function is automatically going to be passed the request. Because remember, middleware is software that's going to run in the middle of the request. So we're automatically passed that request that the middleware is running in the middle of. So export a function that accepts a request as a parameter. And then also, you're going to decide where you want your middleware to run. So here, I am exporting a constant called config, which is an object that has a matcher property. And on this matcher property, I pass an array of strings, and these are going to be the paths that I want this middleware function to run on. So I'm saying I want my middleware to run on the /admin-dashboard page and also on the /dashboard page. So if the user goes to like the sign-in page, I'm not going to run this middleware whatsoever. I'm saying I only want to run it on these paths right here. So those are kind of two important things. Well, really three. Middleware.js file, it is in the root of your directory. It's on the same level as your app directory, but not within your app directory. Same level as your next.config, your readme, your .gitignore file. That's where you're going to place your middleware file. And then you're going to export a function from this file, accepting a request. And then also from this file, export a config, that's an object that has a matcher property that basically tells Next.js what paths you want to run your middleware on. And then here within our function, we can just add our logic for our middleware. So here I'm kind of simulating logic for handling user roles within a middleware file. So here I have a const user roles equal user. Of course, you probably wouldn't hard code this. You might have this in your request body, maybe the user ID or something like that, and then check, does this user have a particular role? And then here I get the URL by calling request.nexturl.clone. So I create a copy of the URL. And then here I check, okay, is the URL admin dashboard and the user role is not admin? So they're trying to go to the admin dashboard, but they don't have a user role that is admin. Then I want to basically make a redirect to where I say URL.pathname is now going to be just dashboard instead of admin dashboard. And then I'm going to redirect them to that new URL. So basically, if they do not have the role of admin, then I want them to be redirected to the dashboard page. And then basically the opposite of this, if they're trying to go to the dashboard page, but their user role is admin, then redirect them to the admin dashboard page. But if neither of those cases are met, then I just want you to continue on with a request and return next response.next, calling that function. And you can import next response from next/server, and it gives you this ability to redirect or just continue on to the request. And there's, of course, other things you can do with the next response. I think I have a video on it, but that is definitely going to be useful within your middleware file. Let's go back to our application and see if this actually works. So currently, my user role is user. So if I try to go to my admin dashboard instead of my dashboard page here, when I hit return here, I should just get redirected right back to dashboard. And you see that it does automatically just change the URL to dashboard. So let me show you again, admin dashboard, hitting return right back to dashboard. But now if I change this and I set my user role to admin here, then it should take me just to the admin dashboard. So I'm here on the dashboard page, but if I refresh this page, it should take me right to admin dashboard. And you can see it does. It takes me now to the admin dashboard. Let's test this out. I'm going to remove admin dashboard from my matcher here. So it should no longer run on my admin dashboard page. So this page I'm at. And if I change my role back to user, I should not get redirected right now, even though I changed it back to user, because my middleware is no longer going to run because I did not place my admin dashboard path within my matcher here. So if I refresh, you see nothing happens because my middleware isn't running anymore, because you need to make sure to place that path within this matcher. So now if I put /admin dashboard, and then now I refresh and my user role is still set to user here, and I refresh, you see it takes me back to dashboard. So a quick recap here, middleware is going to be software that runs in the middle of a request. And it's going to allow you to do different things like authentication and authorization or protecting routes, server-side redirects, logging and analytics, feature flagging, protecting routes from bot traffic, but some not so good use cases are anything that's going to basically slow your middleware down. So complex data fetching, heavy computation, and direct database stuff. And then in Next.js, you just create a middleware file, middleware.js or TS, within the root of your project. So on the same level as your app directory, on the same level as your known modules, not within your app directory. You export a function that accepts a request. You can do different logic within that function, but just make sure that you export a config that is an object with a matcher property, and you pass an array of paths that effectively tell Next.js, hey, this is where I want my middleware to run. And you can pass different things to this matcher. So definitely read the Next.js docs if you're like, hey, can I pass like a regex or something like that? There's a good chance that you can do what you want to do. So make sure to consult the docs. It doesn't have to be exact in this format, but that's how you can use middleware in Next.js. Before we get to the second video of this course on data fetching, I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor of today's video, Kind, the fully integrated developer platform, allowing you to implement modern auth, access management, as well as billing for engineers. On their billing product, they offer various billing tools, so you can start monetizing your ideas without really needing to build anything yourself, and to be able to avoid hard coding that stuff so you can actually focus on building more features rather than messing around with some of that not so fun stuff. They offer powerful provisioning features that are going to allow you to control how your customers access different parts of your app once they subscribe. So for example, maybe on your base plan, they can use a certain product up to 5 times, but then after that, they have to subscribe to a more premium plan. And they also supply webhooks, workflows, and different APIs. You can do it really in a wide variety of different tech stacks, and then also various different business models as well. Whether you're selling to individuals, startups, or global enterprises, Kind is really going to adapt to your business model. You can use their pricing table builder to build out some of these really nice looking tables, and you can provide your own HTML, JavaScript, and CSS to make it really fit in with your brand. You can integrate with Stripe in literally seconds on their platform with a very reasonable 0.5% transaction fee. Plus, you get free monthly active users when you use billing. So click the link below and $50 in Kind credits to try this fully integrated developer platform. Data fetching in Next.js, and then a couple of things to look out for as well. So we'll cover both server and client side data fetching. So if we come to my running application here that fetches the data for this page, what you're going to see is that it looks like about how you would fetch data in just a basic React application, to where we have some state up here. We use a use effect that runs on mount. On mount, we call this fetch post function. It fetches from the JSON placeholder API. If that is successful, it sets the post. And then here below, if we have our posts, we render them out to the page. One important consideration here is that we need to use the use client directive at the top of this page, because we are using other React features within this component like use state as well as the use effect to run this on mount. So because of that, we need to make sure that this is a client side component. So if you need to fetch stuff client side in Next.js, you're going to need the use client directive at the top, and then you're probably going to use the use effect to run it on mount, and then set some state within your fetch request, and then also probably handle some either loading or error state. I think a slightly better way that I could have actually handled this is just having a single status piece of state, to where the status of our post is either loading or error. So it kind of consolidates that state into one piece of state. I think that's generally a little bit better practice, but this will also get the job done just fine. So client side, probably going to use a use effect on mount, make that fetch request, set some state, and then you use the use client directive at the top of the page. And this is a way to do it. You might have to do this sometimes throughout your Next.js applications, and this is still a valid way to fetch data. However, Next.js recommends that you fetch data server side, or at least you first try to fetch data server side. And this is kind of how you do it server side. We can just make our component an asynchronous component right at the top. So export default async function, data fetching server. Right at the top of the page, We can await a fetch request, check if that response is okay or not, and then continue to render out the data from that fetch request. So we don't need a use effect. We don't need a set state. It's much more kind of straightforward, and it'll happen server side, which means if we come back here, if I refresh the page here, you see that we get a little bit of a flicker on the page. To where for a brief second before the data comes in, it sets a loading state, and we see that for just a second here. But if I go to data fetching server, we see it renders. But if I refresh here, we see that we don't get any sort of flicker. It's just kind of more immediate, which is one of the benefits of fetching data on the server. And then not only this, but I just think from a code perspective, it is so much more straightforward to just have like these 3 lines of code here rather than having all of this going on for fetching data client side, where you're setting state, you're using a use effect, you're managing the loading state as well. So you just have more state, you have a use effect. It's a little bit more kind of complex code compared to just this right here. Just we make it an async component. We fetch that data at the top level. We check if the response is okay. And then here we await the response.json and then render out our users to the page. So this would be fetching data server side. And this, of course, is fetching data client side. You can do both, but Next.js recommends fetching data server side for a couple of the reasons that I just mentioned: code cleanliness, as well as you don't kind of run into that flickering issue and can improve performance fetching data server side. Now, what if, as I ask here, and I'm going to cover some future videos that go over some different patterns of fetching data kind of server side and fetching data generally. But what if you needed some client side interaction on this page, on your server side page? Should you convert it to like a client component and then fetch that data client side like we did here? Or what do you do in the case of needing some client side interaction on your server side data fetching page? Well, instead of making this all a client component here, say I had like a button here that needed to handle an on-click event. And anytime you need to handle like a actual user action, it's going to have to be client side. What we would do instead here is we would just create our own client side component and then import it into this page. So rather than having like this client side button and then on click, we will just pass a function that doesn't do anything. We'll just console.log clicked. This is not going to work because event handlers cannot be passed or cannot be used within our kind of server component here. But rather than turning this entire component client side and needing to change all this data fetching into client side data fetching, a much better way to solve this is we can just create a new component. I'm just going to name it client button.jsx, use client at the top, export default function client button, and then we can just return this button here like so. And then here we can instead just render our client button in its place. So then all this still stays server side, but we just kind of leave open a slot to render this client side button. And then here you can see we have no issues. We can click on this button here. And when I open my console, you can see that I was indeed clicking on it 4 times, clicking on it again. So that's all working as expected, but we didn't have to change this all to client side. So that's something to look out for. If you do server side fetching, there's often ways that you can keep it server side, even if you need to do some client side stuff on that page. So just as a quick recap here, for client side fetching, you're going to need to use the use client directive at the top of the page. You're likely going to need to set some state at the top level of that component. You'll likely use a use effect that runs on mount and then makes your fetch request. And then once that request is completed, either sets the data from the request or it sets an error. Or you can alternatively fetch data server side to where you create an async function. You fetch your data just at the top level of your function. You could check if the response is successful or not. If it is, you can then call response.json and await that, and then render out your data just directly. And this is the recommended approach from Next.js. Fetch your data server side. And then if you do need any client side components, you can create those and then just import them into your server component rather than turning all this into client side code. Every now and then in your Next.js applications, you might find that you need to fetch data sequentially. So you make one fetch request, you wait until that fully completes, and then you make the next fetch request. And if we look at the code for this sequential data fetching page, what you see is that we first fetch our user here, and then we fetch our posts. And since our posts are dependent on the user ID, we kind of have to do this sequentially. If you didn't have to do this sequentially and your second request did not rely on the result of your first request, like our post request relying on the user ID here within the URL, if it didn't rely on it, then you could kick off both of these requests at the same time and then use something like promise.all to kind of concurrently fetch this data. But in the case to where they are dependent on each other, there is a better way to kind of structure this page, because right now our second request takes 2 seconds, our first request takes half of a second. So to load this entire page, it's going to take about 2.5 seconds. And if we come back to the page here, let me open up the network tab. And if we look at how long it takes to load this page or this document, it's going to take a little over 2.5 seconds, which isn't ideal. To show you this maybe even a little better here, if I go to just our home Next.js page, and then we navigate to the sequential data fetching page, you're going to see that it's just going to sit here on our home page for about 2.5 seconds until we load our sequential data fetching page, which it would be great if we could kind of improve this user experience a little bit to where maybe we could render out the page when this first request is complete, but then we show like a loader for our post component until that request completes. And with Next.js kind of loading and streaming, you can do exactly that. So if we go to my streaming page, we still have our initial request to get our user, but now on this page, we render a suspense component with a fallback, and we render a separate posts component. So we've kind of split out our posts UI, this UI right here. We've split that out into its own component, and then we just pass the user ID down to this component. And then in the post component, this is where we make the fetch request for the post with the user ID and then render out our posts. But what this allows us to do is we can now just render out this post component with a suspense component wrapped around it, which is going to have the effect of we're going to be able to render this streaming page as soon as the user request completes. And then in the meantime, we will render out this suspense component with a loader until our post request completes. So if we go look at the streaming page here and just kind of make a mental note here, when I go to the streaming page and navigate to it, just think about how quick this feels compared to going to the sequential page. We see it much sooner, and then we load in the posts later. So if I refresh the page, we load our user, and then our posts come in later. But the overall experience here just feels a little bit better. It still takes about 2.5 seconds to render the whole page, but to show you this maybe even a little better, if we go to our home page and we go to our streaming page, you can see that only after half of a second, we actually get to the page and then we render in the post later. So the user could even interact with this page a little bit early. Whereas if we come back to our home page and then we go to sequential, it just sits here for a long amount of time and then it renders the entire page and then we can finally interact with it, which is not the ideal experience. And I think the experience of our streaming page is much better here, to where we kind of progressively stream this page to prevent it just kind of being blocking the entire time. Now, one other important detail here is if we go to our sequential page and you see it takes a while, it just makes the whole kind of application here feel pretty slow. But if I refresh this page and then I click show details, just kind of watch the experience that we see. So I'm going to refresh the page. I'm going to click show details. And then you see the modal just kind of disappears. So I refresh, show details, and then it kind of removes the modal altogether. And that's because we've refreshed the page, and although we can still click the show details button, the entire page gets loaded in and then kind of wipes out that state and removes that button. Whereas on the streaming page, if I do a refresh of the page here and I click show details, what you see is our posts render in, but our modal still stays because we still rendered our entire page when we first see it, and then we can still interact with it. So it also improves the interactivity of your page quite a bit by having this sort of streaming behavior. So hopefully this example makes it clear that kind of streaming that data in can really improve that user experience. So just to kind of recap here, if you need to fetch data sequentially, so one fetch request relies on the other, using streaming is probably a pretty good solution to improve your user experience. And the way that you can do that is for the UI that you want to show from your subsequent request, your request that relies on your other request, you can break that into its own component and then wrap that with the suspense component that you import from React. For that suspense component, you need to give it a fallback. In our case, we just pass in a paragraph tag that says loading post, but this could be a different loader. But you use this suspense component, importing it directly from React, and then you can render your component that is going to make that kind of secondary request. And then that request can occur in that component itself. And when that request completes, it will return all the UI here. But in the meantime, we're going to show this fallback component of loading posts, which is why you see in our streaming here, we see loading posts, and then that is rendered in. But in the meantime, the rest of our page is still going to be interactive here, kind of the top portion of this page that isn't wrapped in the suspense, which in my opinion is going to be a much better user experience. The user is going to be able to see that page sooner if they're originally navigating to it. And overall, I just think it's a much better kind of UI and UX of streaming that data in when you have sequential data fetches rather than just making it all be blocking for that entire page. And whenever possible, if your fetch requests are not sequential here and they're not dependent on each other, then fetch these requests kind of concurrently, make the fetch request at the same time. And then instead of just awaiting each request here, you could use something like promise.all and then wait for the request to resolve that way, rather than kind of having a waterfall effect here. In Next.js, you can use server actions that will let you run server-side logic directly from either client or server components. And this prevents you from needing API routes or even client-side fetch requests. These can be useful for securely mutating data, submitting forms, and keeping your UI and business logic clean and efficient. So server actions, they are kind of functions that run on the server that allow you to perform server-side logic from your components without necessarily needing to create different API routes or other fetch requests. And they can be used in event handlers, in form actions. They can be used really all throughout your code base, and they can be quite useful. So let's look at an example of using a server action when submitting a form, as well as when using a client-side button, because you can use these both server and client-side. So if we come back here, I render out this page, I render out a submit message form component, as well as a client button. So let's look at the submit form here first. And in this form, what you could see is it's just a basic form that has a button and an input. And then for the form action, I set it to this submit message function. And what this function is a server action. So you can see I import it from my server actions file. Your file doesn't need to be named server actions, but there is one thing you do need to have. So if we go to server actions, we can see my submit message function that I export. It is a async function. Your server actions will be async server-side functions. And then here at the top of the file, you can see I use a directive called use server. This is kind of a similar pattern that you might use when using a client component, putting use client at the top. Instead of that, for our server actions, we're going to put the use server directive at the top of the file. And that tells Next.js that within this file, all the functions are going to be server functions. They're going to run on the server. And then all this submit message function does is it accepts the form data from the form, just like any other function would that's in your action attribute. And then we are going to basically just console log form submitted and the message. So if I open my console here, I'm going to do a bunch of return statements so we can see it. I'm going to go back, and if I type in submitting a form, I click submit, we see form submitted, message submitting a form. So everything looks to be working correctly here. We added our server action to the action attribute of our form here of submit message. So then our server action here accepts our form data, and we console it out here down below. Just to see it one more time here, click submit, and we see some form message logged down below. Now, of course, in your actual application, you're not just going to console log something. You might make a post request to your database. You might do some other business logic that you have here when the form is submitted, but you can run all that server side without needing to create different API routes. You can keep your form all server side here. We don't need to use any kind of use client directives or anything like that. And it can be a really nice way, nice clean way to write some server-side logic without needing to spin up API routes and stuff like that. We also render out this client button here. And if we go to the client button, you can see that this is a client component. And instead of calling the server action from the action attribute of a form like we did here in our previous example, we can do that directly within the on click of this button. So I just render out this basic button here. But in the on click, we call or pass in or reference this handle click function that we also import from our server actions file. And within our server actions file, we can see the handle click. It just console logs that the button was clicked. And of course, like I said before, this is where you might have some of your actual business logic for your application. But importantly, it's still within this use server file. So this is going to run server side here, even though it's a client component, which is quite nice. So we just pass that into the on click, importing that from our server actions file. And if I open my console here again and hit a bunch of return statements, so it's nice and clear to us, and I click this button a few times here, what we can see is button clicked, server action triggered, like so. So we can see that that is working as expected, even within a client component. So you can use these server actions both in client and server components, both within on-click handlers and within your action attribute of a form. These are super, super useful and definitely something that you need to know about. Now, in this video, I covered using them within their own file or creating server actions within their own file with the use server directive, but you can also inline these server actions within your components themselves. And you can put the use server directive at the top of the file. And you can see that here in the Next.js docs where they had this async function within this page component, and they use the use server directive right at the top of the body of this function before they do some data mutations and other stuff that you might do within a server action. So you can inline these as well. For me personally, I don't love the way this looks. I think this looks a little less clean. I like to create a separate file like we did here and use the use server directive at the top of the file, but you're going to have different opinions about that and can decide which one that works best for you and your application. In your web application, you can use a strategy called prefetching, which effectively fetches data in the background to make your application feel much more snappy and much more performant when a user is actually interacting with your application. So for example, when you land on a certain page, you might prefetch a different page that is linked from that page. So when they click that link, that page has already been fetched and it makes your application feel very performant. And today we're going to look at doing that within a Next.js application, although you could do that in really any web applications. This prefetching strategy is kind of a concept that you can use in a lot of different places, but we're going to cover it here in this demo application implemented in Next.js. But first, two things. I want to cover the Next.js docs here just a little bit of how that's implemented in Next.js. And then also, I need to apologize. My allergies are kicking my butt right now. And if I sound very nasally or there's a little bit of a sniffle here and there, I apologize, but I'm really getting my butt kicked by my allergies right now. But let's cover the docs here. So prefetching, it is a way to preload a route in the background before the user visits it. So kind of what I explained earlier. And there are two ways routes are prefetched in Next.js. You can use the link component, importing this from NextLink, in which routes are automatically prefetched as they become visible in the user's viewport. Prefetching happens when the page first loads or when it comes into view through scrolling. So if you use the link component from Next.js, which you often should be using to add links to your page, Next.js by default is going to prefetch that route that you're linking to when that page first load that contains that link, or when it comes into view through scrolling. So Next.js kind of already automatically prefetches using the link component. So in our example today, we're not really going to cover this one because Next.js kind of already does it for you. I just want to make sure that you knew that that's already implemented out of the black box with NextLink. And I would generally recommend using NextLink for your links whenever possible. But you might also have cases to where maybe client side, you're going to be navigating through like the router.push method. And when doing this, it's not automatically going to prefetch your routes. However, when you do that client-side navigation, you can use router.prefetch to programmatically prefetch the route. And that's what we're going to kind of look at here today. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about like the default behaviors and kind of more nuances of how that works, I definitely have videos on the link component, and you can definitely read the docs here. I'll make sure to link this in the description below. But to get to the example here, we're going to open the network tab, and then I'm also going to show you the code here. So what we have here is a client component. I import use router from Next navigation, and then I have this handle prefetch function that calls router.prefetch, and then I pass in a relative path that I want to prefetch. And if we go look at this blog page, basically all it does is renders a title and a paragraph saying like blog page, and then it also simulates a 2-second delay. So this would be like simulating if you fetched a whole list of blogs and maybe the server was running a little slow and it took a couple of seconds. This will just allow us to see the benefit of prefetching a little bit more. And then if we come back to my homepage here, that's a client component. I have two different buttons. One button is going to on mouse enter. So when the user starts to just put their mouse over this button, it's going to call this handle prefetch function, which is going to prefetch the blog page. And then when they click on it, it's going to call router.push to push them to the /blog page. But then I have another button here to kind of show the difference between the two. It doesn't handle the on mouse enter event here, and it doesn't do any prefetching. It just navigates straight to the blog page. So we're going to show a non-prefetched button to navigate to the blog page, and then a prefetched version. And just to make sure that we're totally clear here, in this case, I'm showing this for demonstration purposes to show you how prefetching works and how you can do that with the use router hook here in Next.js. But just know if you're just linking to a different page, use the link from NextLink and it will automatically handle prefetching for you. But I just wanted to show in those cases where you want to do some client-side navigation with router.push, how can you also prefetch in those cases? So if we come back to my browser here, what you're going to see here in the network tab is as soon as I hover over my go to blog prefetch button, it's going to make a network request to prefetch my blog page. But if I just navigate through this go to blog button, it should take a 2-second delay. Now, one thing to be very aware of here, when it comes to prefetching in Next.js, it only is going to do this in a production build. It's not going to do it when you just run npm run dev and you run your development server. I have already run a build and now I have served this build to localhost. So I ran npm run build and then npm run start. So I'm using my production build here, that's where you're going to see prefetching. If you try to spin this up and you don't build first and you just run npm run dev, you're not going to see the prefetching behavior. So just want to make sure you're aware of that to save you some time if you're going to kind of try this out in your local application as well. But on this production build here, we should be able to see this prefetching behavior. So let's first just try to go to this blog page without prefetching just to see the delay that it takes. So I'm going to click on this. You can see it fetches my blog page. And then after about 2 seconds here, we see the blog page. So if I come back, I'm going to refresh just to prevent like any caching or anything. I'm going to clear this. We're going to go to it again. You see it takes about 2 seconds and then we arrive to that page. Now, if I refresh and clear the console again, if I just hover over, go to blog, you see that it makes that request right away. And then if I click on it, it should be pretty much instant here. And it is. So you can already see here, when doing this approach, it can really improve the perception of performance in your application because we already prefetched this route. So then it just becomes instant. And from a user's perspective, this feels much better. Now, of course, this is just an example for demonstration purposes. If the user was really quick about it and they hover over this and basically click right away, you still have a little bit of a delay there, but you might have a case in your application to where this sort of behavior maybe makes a lot of sense. And you go and you decide to prefetch on mouse over, and maybe this works really well in your application, but just conceptually speaking, just understand the concept that prefetching can help improve the performance of your application a lot. And you can kind of programmatically do it when the user takes different actions. It, of course, doesn't have to just be hovering over a button like what I'm showing here. There might be cases where this actually doesn't make a lot of sense because maybe you always expect the user to just come and click here automatically, and it doesn't kind of let your prefetch request finish before they click, so it really doesn't improve the performance that much. But I'm sure there are cases and scenarios that you'll run into where maybe you're like, man, my app feels so slow when navigating this page. Maybe there is a user event where you can programmatically prefetch to really improve that experience quite a bit. So in summary here, prefetching is a way to preload a route in the background before the user visits it. In Next.js, if you use the link component from NextLink, routes are automatically prefetched as they become visible in the user's viewport. But there might be cases to where you want to navigate client side and use like router.push. And in those scenarios, you can still use prefetching using router.prefetch. And then you just pass in the URL path that you want to prefetch, and you can programmatically kind of improve the performance of your application. And we saw this here where the user on the on mouse enter event, we called this handle prefetch function. We called the router.prefetch after getting the router instance from the use router hook from Next Navigation. We call the router.prefetch with the path that we wanted to prefetch. And then in our application here, we saw that when we hover over this, it makes a request to prefetch the blog page. And now when we click it, it feels instant compared to if we just click on our button that doesn't do any prefetching here and we try to navigate to it, there's a 2-second delay because of the code that we have in place. And just keep in mind, prefetching is only going to work in your built applications. If you just try to do npm run dev and you're just running locally without a built application, you're not going to see this prefetching behavior. We're going to go over something that can be pretty tricky in Next.js and really in your web applications in general, or just a general kind of tricky software engineering issue. And what we're going to go over today is revalidation. Now, more specifically, today we're going to go over in Next.js, how does revalidation work when you're using the fetch function when making network requests and stuff like that? So we have our application up and running here. So if we go to the code, what you're going to see is I just have this quote page that basically awaits a fetch from this API that basically just is a free API that returns random quotes. And then we await the response.json, destructuring the quote and the author, and then showing those to the page, which you see right here. And of course, we have some Tailwind CSS styles to make this look at least decent. So with that, what do you think is going to happen when I refresh this page? Do you think that I'm going to get a new quote here, or what do you think is going to happen? And just so you're aware, I did build this application and then I served this application to localhost. So we are looking at a build application. So I ran npm run build and then npm run start. And that's important because in Next.js, you can get some different caching and revalidation behavior depending on if you're running a built application versus just running locally. I'm running this built because I think that in a real life application, you're going to build that and serve it, and this will be a little bit more realistic. So let's come back. And if I just do Command R and I refresh my page a few times, which it's kind of hard to see here because it's so quick, but you can see this kind of flickering a little bit. So I am indeed refreshing it, but you're not seeing this quote change here. And that's because this quote is just getting cached and returned. We are never kind of revalidating to get a new random quote. And of course, this is just an example calling this random quote API, but you probably will have situations in your applications where you don't want the cache data to just get served every single time. So how can we kind of adjust this behavior? Well, there's different ways to do this, but what we're going to look at today is we can pass a second option to the fetch function. We're going to pass an object and we're going to give it a next property. And on this next property, we're going to point that to another object. And on this next object, we're going to pass a revalidate property. And then we can set this to a couple of different things. We can set it to a number in which it will tell Next.js, okay, when this fetch request runs again, when this page is refreshed, has this amount of time gone by? Should we revalidate this API endpoint and see if we get new data? Well, let's actually just show you how that works. So I'm going to pass a 5 in here. So it's going to say basically revalidate this every 5 seconds. So if I come back, I'm going to kill this. I'm going to run npm run build. We're going to build it again. I'm sorry, some of that's cut off, but you can see the command I ran. And then once this finishes, we're going to run npm run start and start this up again. I'm going to do a hard refresh just for good measure here. You see, I do get a new quote, but now I'm going to wait a little bit of time here, let 5 seconds go by, and clearly let 5 seconds go by for the sake of the video not having you sit here for a ton of time. I assure you, I did let that time go by. I just probably edited that and made it a little bit easier to watch, but I definitely waited at least like 10 or 15 seconds. So I'm going to do Command R and refresh the page. And what you see is that nothing happened. And what happened here is that, okay, 5 seconds went by. So we did revalidate this. However, in Next.js, this is going to kind of work as stale while revalidate. We revalidated this, but it still shows you the stale data because it kind of eagerly shows you that stale data so it doesn't take more time while we revalidated the cache. So what that means is 5 seconds went by, we just revalidated the cache, but we still see the stale data. If I hit refresh again, we now see a new quote because now it shows us the new data. So that's kind of an important thing to remember is if you set this to a certain number, all it's telling Next.js and all we're doing here is for this fetch request, we're passing revalidate of 5. So after 5 seconds go by, I want you to revalidate this cache. However, when you revalidate it, it's still going to show the stale data initially, to where you're not going to get that revalidated new data until technically you are refreshing this twice, which can be a little bit confusing, but it's just kind of how this works. What if we pass 0 into this? Well, let's see how this looks. I'm going to kill it again. I'm going to run npm run build. Then I'm going to run npm run start. And then I just did a hard refresh there for good measure, which is probably why you see another quote. But if I do Command R here again, you see I get a new quote. And again, a new quote. Again, a new quote. So now every time I do this, I get new quotes. Because basically, when I pass revalidate of 0 here, it's basically saying just don't cache this endpoint and just call this endpoint every single time that this page refreshes, which actually in our scenario, you might actually want. Now, we might actually have a button for the user to press to revalidate and generate a new quote, but maybe you just want every time this page refreshes is when you want a new quote. And in this case, if we pass revalidate of 0, that's what's going to happen here. Every time I refresh, we get a new quote. So again, that's different than if I pass a number here. When that amount of time goes by, Next.js is going to revalidate this endpoint, but it still shows that stale data on that first request, and then it will show you the new data on that second. Now we can also pass false here. And this is actually going to take us back to the default behavior that we saw earlier. But let's run npm run build again, and then we will serve this with npm run start. And now let's see how this works. Refreshed it for good measure there. But now if I continuously hit Command R, you see that we just get the same quote over and over again. So this takes us back to the default behavior, like I said. It basically means that we're just going to cache this, and it's not going to get revalidated if it's the same call to the same endpoint and no query parameters changed or anything like that. It's just going to return this data, which in a lot of cases is okay, but sometimes you want to control that revalidation behavior. Maybe you want it to be a certain amount of time that goes by that you want it to revalidate. So, it's maybe unlikely that it's just going to be 5 seconds, but maybe you pass a certain amount of time here. Maybe you want it to basically turn caching off and you just want it to always revalidate, and you pass 0 here. This is how you can control it. To your fetch function, as a second argument, you can pass an object. On that object, you can pass a next property. You can point that next property to an object. And then on that next object, you can pass a revalidate property and either set that to 0, which basically says, hey, turn caching off here. You can explicitly set it to false, which is basically just going to be the default behavior to where it's just going to cache this endpoint and it's not going to do the revalidation. Or you can set it to a certain amount of time, saying, hey, I want you to revalidate this endpoint after a certain amount of time. So hopefully that helps a little bit. I know for me, at least, this can be kind of a tricky thing when getting into caching and revalidation, but in real world applications, this stuff is definitely important and this stuff matters. So thanks for tuning into this, and I'll see you in that next one.